In those years, when we look back across the long arc of our shared memory, time seems to have moved with a different intention. The days did not hurry toward their end, and the mornings did not feel pressed by invisible demands. Many of us remember waking to a world that felt proportioned to human pace, where sounds arrived softly and departures were rarely abrupt. The 1960s were not experienced as an era in the grand sense while we lived through them. They were simply the present, unfolding with quiet regularity, shaped by habits so familiar that we scarcely noticed how deeply they were teaching us how to live. We often remember the way homes held their silence in the early hours. Before voices filled the rooms, before radios were adjusted or doors opened, there was a moment of stillness that belonged to everyone. The house itself seemed awake, waiting. Floors creaked not from age but from use, a sound so common it became comforting. Windows filtered the light gently, and the day entered without urgency. In those moments, life did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, as if respecting the fact that we were still gathering ourselves. Daily routines were not scheduled as tasks to be completed, but were lived as sequences that flowed naturally from one another. Breakfast did not interrupt the morning. It began it. The table was not merely a surface, but a place where presence mattered. We learned, without being told, that sitting together had meaning. Conversation was not constant, nor was silence awkward. Both were allowed to exist side by side. In those pauses, we absorbed more than words. We learned how to listen, how to wait, how to be with others without needing to fill every moment. Outside the home, the world moved with similar restraint. Streets were not empty, but they were not crowded with distraction. People walked with awareness, not because they were instructed to do so, but because there was little reason not to. Encounters happened face to face, and recognition came easily. A nod, a pause, a brief exchange of words carried enough weight to sustain a sense of connection. We did not feel anonymous in our own neighborhoods. Over time, familiarity became a quiet form of belonging. Work followed rhythms that were understood rather than enforced. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end to the day, and those boundaries were respected. Many of us recall how labor, whatever its form, was tied closely to visible effort. Hands showed their work, and time revealed its passage through tangible results. The pace allowed for attention. One did not rush through tasks only to forget the moments later. Completion carried a sense of closure, and rest followed without guilt. Leisure, too, had a different shape. It was not something to be optimized or justified. It simply occurred when work was done and daylight remained. Evenings unfolded slowly, often marked by small, repeated gestures. A chair pulled closer to a window. A light turned on as dusk settled. A familiar voice heard from another room. These moments were not planned for effect. They were simply part of living, and because of that, they carried a quiet richness. We learned values not through explanation, but through repetition. Watching someone arrive on time taught us the importance of reliability. Seeing care taken with ordinary objects showed us respect for what we owned. Listening to measured speech revealed that words mattered. No one gathered us to declare these lessons. They entered us gradually, almost unnoticed, through the consistency of daily life. Over the years, those small observations shaped our sense of what was proper, considerate, and sufficient. The social fabric of the time was woven from small, dependable interactions. Invitations were extended with sincerity, and they were accepted with intention. When people gathered, they did so without distraction. Attention was given fully because there was little else competing for it. Shared experiences unfolded in real time, unrecorded and unrepeatable. Memory, not documentation, preserved their meaning. What remained was not an image or a record, but a feeling carried forward. Communication required patience. Messages traveled at human speed, and replies were not immediate. Waiting was not seen as a failure of efficiency, but as part of the exchange. Anticipation had its own quiet pleasure. The absence of constant updates allowed imagination to remain active. We filled the space between words with thought, reflection, and sometimes simply with rest. Children observed the world more than they were directed through it. They learned by watching how adults moved, spoke, and responded. Correction was often subtle. conveyed through example rather than reprimand. The boundaries of behavior were understood through atmosphere as much as instruction. Respect was not demanded, it was modeled. Over time, this created a sense of internal guidance that did not rely heavily on external enforcement. Public spaces carried an unspoken code of conduct. Voices adjusted naturally to their surroundings. Presence was acknowledged, even among strangers. There was a shared understanding that one belonged to something larger than oneself, even if that something was simply the moment at hand. Courtesy was not formalized. It was habitual. It emerged from a mutual recognition of shared space and shared time. Technology existed, but it did not dominate attention. Devices served specific purposes, and then receded into the background. When they were no longer needed, they were turned off or set aside. This allowed thought to wander without interruption. Silence was not feared. It was accepted as a natural condition, one that gave shape to the day rather than disrupting it. Meals extended beyond nourishment. They marked time and reinforced connection. Preparation was unhurried, and consumption was not rushed. There was a rhythm to eating that mirrored the larger rhythm of life. The end of a meal signaled transition, not merely completion. Clearing the table was part of the experience, a shared responsibility that closed the moment gently. We remember how evenings settled in layers. Light faded gradually, and with it came a shift in tone. The day did not end abruptly. It softened. Sound became fewer, movement slower. There was space for reflection without ceremony. One could sit and simply be present, feeling the weight of the day dissolve without needing to articulate it. The sense of time passing was not accompanied by anxiety. Days moved forward, but they did not feel as though they were slipping away. There was confidence in continuity. Tomorrow would resemble today in structure, if not in detail. This predictability was not experienced as monotony, but as reassurance. It allowed attention to rest in the present without constant concern for what came next. Over the years, these patterns accumulated into something larger than routine. They formed a way of being that emphasized steadiness over speed, presence over performance. We did not articulate this philosophy because it did not feel like a philosophy. It was simply life as it was lived. Only later, when contrasts emerged, did we begin to recognize the quiet coherence of that earlier world. Memory does not preserve everything equally. Certain details fade, while others remain vivid. What tends to endure is not the extraordinary, but the ordinary. A familiar sound, a repeated gesture, a shared silence. These fragments carry the essence of the time more faithfully than any dramatic event. They remind us that meaning often resides in what was consistent rather than what was exceptional. As we look back now, we do so not with longing but with recognition. We see a world that operated at a human scale, where connection was built gradually and maintained through presence rather than effort. It was a world that allowed room for observation, for learning without instruction, for growth without haste. The quiet of those years was not emptiness. It was space generously offered. And in that space, many of us learned how to inhabit time itself. As those years unfolded, the sense of belonging did not come from grand gestures or declared identities, but from repetition and proximity. We recognized places not by signs or labels, but by familiarity. A street corner held meaning because we had stood there many times before. A shop was known not for its display, but for the way it fit into the rhythm of the day. Movement through the world felt intuitive, guided by memory rather than instruction. We knew where we were because we had been there again and again. Time was measured less by clocks and more by sequences. Morning light signaled one set of behaviors, afternoon another, evening yet another. These transitions were felt physically. The body adjusted without resistance, responding to cues that were steady and reliable. We did not question the passage of time because it did not confront us. It accompanied us. The day moved forward like a familiar path, and we followed without needing to hurry. There was an unspoken understanding that not everything needed to be expressed. Much was conveyed through tone, posture, and timing. A pause before speaking carried meaning. A glance could replace a sentence. We learned early that restraint was not absence, but intention. Words were chosen with care, not because they were scarce, but because they were respected. Speaking less often meant being heard more clearly when one did speak. Domestic life was shaped by this same principle of quiet continuity. Objects were kept for long periods, not out of nostalgia, but because they served their purpose well. Familiar items carried the marks of use, and those marks were not hidden, where it was accepted as evidence of life lived. There was no urgency to replace what still functioned. Maintenance was part of care, and care was understood as responsibility rather than obligation. Cleaning, repairing, arranging. These were not chores to be endured, but acts that sustained order. Order itself was not rigid. It allowed for variation, for personal habits, for imperfection. What mattered was that things had their place, and that returning them there restored a sense of calm. Through these repeated acts, we learned that stability was not something imposed from outside, but something created gradually through attention. Social expectations were present, but they were rarely articulated. One learned how to behave by observing how others behaved. This required attentiveness. Watching became a form of participation. We absorbed the cadence of interaction, the acceptable distance between people, the moment when one should speak and when one should remain silent. These were not rules written down, yet they were widely understood. Public life reflected the same measured pace. Gatherings formed naturally and dissolved without ceremony. There was no pressure to perform or to document. Presence was sufficient. When events ended, they ended. There was no lingering sense that something had been missed or that it needed to be preserved beyond memory. The experience itself was considered complete. In those days, the idea of productivity was closely tied to usefulness. Effort was valued not for its visibility, but for its contribution. Doing one thing well was often considered enough. The accumulation of small, well-executed tasks gave shape to the day. At its conclusion, there was satisfaction not in achievement as a concept, but in the quiet knowledge that what needed to be done had been done. Rest followed work naturally. It was not framed as recovery from exhaustion, but as a rightful phase of the cycle. Sitting down carried no sense of apology. Pausing did not require justification. The body recognized when it was time to slow, and slowing was accepted. In this way, balance was maintained without conscious planning. We remember how evenings invited a different quality of attention. Conversations softened. Movements became more deliberate. There was room for reflection without self-examination. One could think without needing to reach a conclusion. Thoughts drifted, settled, and sometimes simply passed through without consequence. This mental openness was not cultivated deliberately. It emerged because there was space for it. The absence of constant stimulation allowed memory to deepen. Experiences were not layered over one another too quickly. Each had time to register. This gave recollection a certain clarity. When we think back now, we are often surprised by how much detail remains. Not because those moments were extraordinary, but because they were allowed to settle fully before the next one arrived. Education, in its broadest sense, extended beyond formal settings. Learning occurred through observation, repetition, and quiet correction. There was patience in the process. Understanding was expected to take time. Mistakes were part of progression, not evidence of failure. This fostered confidence without urgency. One did not feel constantly measured, but gradually shaped. Authority was present, yet it was often understated. Guidance came through example more than command. This created a sense of trust. We trusted that there was a structure, even if we did not always see it clearly. That trust reduced anxiety. One could move forward knowing that there were boundaries, even if they were not always visible. Community existed not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. It was reinforced through repeated encounters and shared routines. The same faces appeared in predictable places. Over time, recognition turned into familiarity, and familiarity into quiet assurance. There was comfort in being known, even if only slightly. One did not need to explain oneself repeatedly. Presence itself carried context. The passage of seasons was felt distinctly. Changes in light temperature and activity marked time more reliably than dates. Each season brought its own expectations and adjustments. These changes were anticipated without impatience. They reminded us that life moved in cycles larger than any individual day. This awareness grounded us, providing perspective without requiring reflection. Entertainment, when it occurred, was experienced collectively. Attention was directed toward a shared focal point. There was agreement, implicit and temporary, about where focus would rest. This shared attention created a sense of unity. Even disagreement unfolded within a framework of mutual presence. One could respond to the same moment. Even if reactions differed, the absence of constant choice simplified experience. Options existed, but they were not overwhelming. Decisions were made within familiar parameters. This reduced mental strain. Energy could be directed toward engagement rather than selection. Life felt navigable because its boundaries were intelligible. Looking back, we see how these conditions supported a form of quiet resilience. Without naming it, we learned how to endure change, how to wait, how to remain attentive without becoming restless. These skills were not taught directly. They were absorbed through living in a world that moved at a pace aligned with human attention. As time moved on, these patterns became internalized. Even when circumstances shifted, the underlying sensibility remained. We carried forward an understanding of rhythm, of proportion, of the value of unhurried presence. It is this inheritance, more than any specific detail, that defines our memory of that quieter, closer world. As we continue to reflect on those years, it becomes clear that much of what shaped daily life did so quietly, without calling attention to itself. The fabric of ordinary days was woven from small decisions made almost unconsciously. We chose to wait rather than interrupt, to observe before reacting, to finish what we began before moving on. These choices were rarely framed as virtues. They were simply how things were done, reinforced by repetition and shared expectation. The pace of conversation reflected this sensibility. Speech unfolded at a tempo that allowed meaning to settle. Interruptions were rare, not because they were forbidden, but because they felt unnecessary. Listening was understood as part of speaking. One waited not out of politeness alone, but because there was an assumption that what was being said deserved completion. Silence between sentences was not discomfort. It was space for thought. We recall how attention was not constantly divided. When we focused on something, we did so fully, without the sense that something else demanded immediate notice. This gave experiences a sense of completeness. A task, a conversation, a walk, all were entered and exited deliberately. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. Closure was not rushed. It arrived naturally, signaled by subtle cues rather than abrupt transitions. Movement through the day felt grounded in physical reality. Walking was not merely a means of getting somewhere. It was a way of being present. The body engaged with its surroundings, adjusting to terrain, weather, and distance. This engagement fostered awareness. We noticed small changes in our environment because we moved through it slowly enough to perceive them. The built environment itself seemed designed for human scale. Spaces encouraged pause rather than acceleration. There were places to sit, to lean, to stand without purpose other than being there. These spaces invited observation. Watching others pass by became a quiet form of participation. We learned about life not only by doing, but by noticing. Sound played a different role. It was less constant, more intentional. When noise occurred, it was usually tied to activity. The absence of sound was common and accepted. Silence did not feel empty. It felt complete. In that silence, thoughts could form without being hurried. Reflection was not scheduled. It emerged naturally. We often remember how evenings extended rather than ended. The transition from day to night was gradual, marked by diminishing light and slowing movement. Artificial illumination supplemented rather than replaced natural rhythms. This gradual shift allowed the body and mind to follow along without resistance. Rest came as an invitation, not a collapse. Objects around us carried stories, not because they were rare, but because they endured. Familiar items became companions through repeated use. Their presence was reassuring. We knew their weight, their texture, their function. There was comfort in this familiarity. It reduced the need for constant adjustment. Life felt stable because its elements were consistent. Repair was valued alongside acquisition. When something broke, the first instinct was often to fix it. This fostered patience and problem solving. It also created a relationship with objects that went beyond convenience. Caring for what one owned was a way of caring for one's environment. Waste was avoided not through policy, but through habit. These practices reinforced a sense of sufficiency. Having enough was truly enough. Desire was tempered by practicality. Comparison existed, but it did not dominate perception. The measure of success was not constant expansion, but reliable continuity. This allowed contentment to take root quietly. Social bonds were strengthened through shared time rather than shared spectacle. Being together did not require elaborate planning. Presence itself was the offering. Even when little was said, the act of sitting together carried meaning. We learned that connection did not depend on constant affirmation. It grew through proximity and repetition. Children grew within this atmosphere, absorbing its rhythms without conscious effort. Play unfolded within clear boundaries, yet allowed for imagination. Time was not segmented into tightly controlled intervals. This openness encouraged creativity. Without constant direction, children learned to negotiate space, to resolve small conflicts, to entertain themselves. Guidance, when offered, was often indirect. Correction came through example rather than instruction. This required attentiveness from both sides. Learning became a shared process, unfolding gradually. The absence of constant evaluation reduced pressure. Growth was allowed to be uneven, shaped by curiosity rather than urgency. Public discourse reflected similar restraint. Differences of opinion existed, but they were expressed within a framework of mutual recognition. Disagreement did not necessarily imply division. There was space for nuance, for reconsideration. The pace of exchange allowed ideas to develop rather than collide. The sense of future was present, but it did not overshadow the present. Planning occurred, but it was grounded in expectation rather than anxiety. One assumed that tomorrow would arrive much like today, carrying both familiarity and variation. This assumption provided stability. It reduced the need for constant anticipation. Memory, too, was shaped by this environment. Experiences were stored not as fragments competing for attention, but as coherent sequences. Recollection unfolded smoothly, guided by sensory detail. We remember how things felt as much as what happened. This emotional continuity gives memory its depth. As years passed, we carried these internalized rhythms forward. Even as circumstances changed, the underlying sensibility remained. We recognized when life moved too quickly because we had known a different pace. We understood the value of pause because we had lived within it. Looking back now, we do not idealize the past as perfect. We recognize its limitations and challenges. Yet we also acknowledge the quiet strengths embedded in its routines. The world of the 1960s offered a model of living that aligned closely with human attention, patience, and presence. It was a world that trusted gradualness. Change occurred, but it unfolded within continuity. Innovation did not demand constant disruption. Progress was measured, allowing time for adjustment. This steadiness fostered resilience. One could adapt without losing orientation. As we reflect on that closer, quieter world, we do so with a sense of gratitude rather than longing. We recognize what it gave us, an understanding of time that was generous, an approach to living that valued depth over speed, and a way of being that honored the human capacity for attention. These lessons were not taught explicitly. They were lived, and because they were lived, they remain with us still, informing how we move through the present, even as the world around us continues to change. As the years accumulated, the sense of continuity became one of the most defining features of daily life. We rarely spoke of stability, yet we lived within it. The familiar returned each day with slight variation, enough to keep attention alive, but not so much as to unsettle. This balance shaped our relationship with time. We trusted it because it behaved predictably. It moved forward without rushing us, allowing us to remain present rather than constantly preparing for what followed. The structure of the week carried meaning without rigidity. Certain days held particular expectations, understood rather than announced. These expectations provided orientation. We knew, almost instinctively, what kind of day it was. This awareness influenced our behavior, our energy, even our tone of voice. Life did not feel like an uninterrupted stream, but like a sequence of recognizable moments, each with its own character. Morning hours invited attention and effort, There was clarity in that part of the day, a sense that one's mind and body were aligned. Tasks undertaken then felt purposeful. Completion was satisfying not because it was measured, but because it was felt. The afternoon brought a natural easing, a subtle shift toward maintenance rather than initiation. Evening belonged to reflection and rest, not as a rule, but as a rhythm the body understood. Meals continued to anchor the day. They provided punctuation, marking transitions without announcement. Sitting down together, even briefly, created pauses that restored balance. Food was prepared with care, but without spectacle. The act itself mattered more than presentation. Sharing it reinforced a sense of order and belonging. The repetition of these moments created reassurance. One could count on them. Conversation followed the same patterns. Topics unfolded slowly, often revisiting familiar ground. Repetition was not avoided. It was welcomed. Through it, meaning deepened. Stories gained texture with each telling, shaped by memory and context. Listening became an act of respect, not only toward the speaker, but toward the shared past that connected everyone present. We learned patience through waiting. Waiting for news, for outcomes, for opportunities. The delay was not experienced as loss, but as part of the process. Anticipation allowed time for adjustment, for acceptance, for hope tempered by realism. The outcome, when it arrived, felt earned simply because time had been allowed to pass. Workplaces reflected the sensibility as well. Progress was visible, but rarely dramatic. Change occurred incrementally. Skills developed over time, through repetition and refinement. Mastery was understood as a gradual accumulation of experience rather than a sudden achievement. This fostered humility. One remained aware that learning never truly ended. The relationship between generations was shaped by proximity and shared routines. Older and younger people occupied the same spaces, participated in the same rhythms. Knowledge passed through observation as much as explanation. Younger individuals learned how to behave not through formal instruction alone, but by watching how older ones carried themselves. Respect flowed naturally from familiarity. Discipline, when present, was often quiet. Boundaries were clear, but they were not constantly enforced. The expectation of appropriate behavior was internalized early. This created a sense of responsibility that did not rely heavily on supervision. One acted correctly because it felt right, not because it was monitored. Public life maintained a similar tone. Events unfolded without excessive amplification. There was room for disagreement, but also for restraint. Opinions were expressed with awareness of context. The pace of exchange allowed for consideration. This reduced the pressure to respond immediately, making room for reflection. The absence of constant urgency shaped emotional life as well. Feelings were experienced fully, but they were not amplified by constant comparison or exposure. Joy had time to settle. Disappointment had space to soften. Emotional recovery was supported by the steady rhythm of daily life. One could move forward without feeling rushed to resolve everything at once. Memory formed within this environment took on a particular quality. It was layered, coherent, and deeply tied to sensory detail. We remember not only events, but the atmosphere surrounding them, the light, the sounds, the pace. These elements give memory its enduring power. They allow us to revisit moments without distortion. The sense of self developed gradually. Identity was not something one declared or curated. It emerged through participation in daily life. One became known through consistency rather than assertion. Reputation was built over time, shaped by repeated actions. This fostered accountability. Actions mattered because they endured in memory. Leisure activities reflected the same orientation. Enjoyment did not require novelty. Familiar pleasures remained satisfying. Repetition did not dull experience. It deepened it. One could return to the same activity many times and still find meaning. This cultivated contentment, a quiet appreciation for what was already present. Nature played a steady role in daily awareness. Whether it was noticed, not managed, seasons influenced behavior naturally. These changes provided context, reminding us that life moved within larger cycles. This awareness fostered humility. One recognized that control was limited and acceptance was necessary. As we think back now, we recognize how these patterns supported resilience. Life contained difficulty, as it always does. Yet the steadiness of daily routines provided grounding. One could endure challenges knowing that certain aspects of life will remain unchanged. This continuity offered comfort without denying reality. The world felt closer because it operated at a human scale. Interactions were direct, environments navigable, expectations comprehensible. There was less distance between effort and outcome, between action and consequence. This clarity reduced confusion. One understood one's place within the larger whole. Silence remained an essential element. It was not something to be filled, but something to be respected. In silence, thoughts aligned, feelings settled. One could simply exist without performing. This capacity for quiet presence became an internal resource, carried forward even as external conditions changed. As years passed and the world evolved, many of us retained this internal rhythm. We recognized when life moved too quickly because we had known a different pace. We understood the value of pause because we had lived within it. These understandings did not fade. They remained, shaping our responses to change. Looking back, we see the 1960s not as a distant era defined by events, but as a way of inhabiting time. It was a period marked by closeness, not through intensity, but through continuity. It was quieter, not because there was less life, but because life was allowed to unfold without constant interruption. This understanding deepens with time. The longer we live, the more clearly we see how those early rhythms shaped us. They gave us a foundation that continues to support us, even now, as we move through a world that often feels faster and more fragmented. As our recollection continues, we begin to sense how deeply the ordinary pace of those years shaped our inner lives. Without realizing it, we learn to measure ourselves not against constant change, but against continuity. There was comfort in knowing where one stood, in recognizing familiar patterns that returned day after day. This familiarity did not limit us. It steadied us. It allowed thought and character to develop gradually, without pressure to redefine oneself repeatedly. The passage of time felt tangible yet gentle. Days were distinct, but not sharply divided. One flowed into the next with subtle variation. We noticed small differences because the overall structure remained stable. This made attention more sensitive. When something changed, it was felt. When something remained the same, it reassured. Life unfolded like a long conversation rather than a series of interruptions. We often recall how responsibilities were understood as part of belonging. Contributing to daily life was not framed as sacrifice, but as participation. Each person had a role, sometimes modest, sometimes demanding, but always connected to the whole. This connection gave meaning to effort. One did not feel isolated in one's duties. They were shared, observed, and quietly acknowledged. The sense of accountability that emerged from this environment was subtle yet strong. One's actions mattered because they were visible over time. Reputations were built slowly, reinforced by consistency. Trust was not declared. It was earned through repetition. This created a social fabric that relied less on enforcement and more on expectation. People acted responsibly because it felt natural to do so. Language itself reflected this sensibility. Speech was measured, attended to tone and context. Exaggeration was uncommon. Statements were grounded in experience rather than speculation. This did not mean that imagination was absent. On the contrary, imagination thrived within these boundaries. It was given room to unfold quietly, without being constantly stimulated or directed. We remember how stories were shared not for performance, but for connection. Narratives were passed along gradually, shaped by memory rather than precision. Each telling carried traces of the teller's perspective. This variability was accepted. Accuracy mattered, but emotional truth mattered more. Stories served as bridges between people, linking experiences across time. There was an ease in how people occupied shared spaces. Public and private boundaries were understood intuitively. One did not intrude without invitation, nor withdraw excessively. This balance fostered mutual respect. Being present did not require assertion. One's place was recognized through familiarity. The rhythm of the seasons reinforced this balance. Changes arrived gradually, allowing time for adjustment. The body adapted without struggle. Clothing, activity, and mood shifted in response to external cues. These adaptations were not planned, they were felt. Nature provided a steady framework within which daily life unfolded. In this context, patience was not something one practiced deliberately. It was simply required by circumstance. Outcomes took time. Processes unfolded at their own pace. This taught endurance without naming it. Waiting became a normal part of life, not a source of frustration. Anticipation carried its own quiet pleasure. The absence of constant urgency shaped how we experience emotion. Feelings were allowed to emerge and recede naturally. There was space for reflection before response. This reduced reactivity. One learned to sit with uncertainty, to allow understanding to develop gradually. Emotional intelligence was cultivated through lived experience rather than instruction. We also recall how attention was directed outward as much as inward. Awareness of others' needs, moods, and circumstances developed through observation. This fostered empathy without sentimentality. One did not need to articulate concern constantly. It was shown through small gestures, through consistency, through presence. Work, when difficult, was approached with perseverance rather than haste. Challenges were addressed step by step. Solutions emerged gradually. This approach reduced anxiety. One trusted that effort, applied steadily, would yield results. Failure was not final. It was part of learning. Leisure moments were woven into this fabric seamlessly. They did not stand apart as escapes from life. They were part of it. Enjoyment was found in simple activities, repeated over time. These pleasures did not diminish with familiarity. They deepened. Familiarity itself became a source of comfort. The sense of enoughness permeated daily life. Ambition existed, but it was tempered by realism. Progress was desired, but not at the expense of stability. This balance allowed satisfaction to coexist with aspiration. One could want more without feeling dissatisfied with what was already present. Community support was embedded in routine rather than formalized structures. Help was offered quietly, often without being requested. Reciprocity was assumed. Over time, this created resilience. Individuals felt supported not because assistance was guaranteed, but because it was habitual. Memory formed within this environment retained coherence. Experiences were not fragmented by constant interruption. They were integrated into a larger narrative of life. This gave recollection a sense of continuity. One could trace connections across years, seeing how earlier moments influenced later ones. As we look back now, we recognize how this coherence shaped our sense of identity. We knew who we were because our lives followed recognizable patterns. Identity was not something to be asserted repeatedly. It emerged through participation, through consistency, through time. The quieter world of the 1960s did not eliminate complexity. It contained its own challenges and uncertainties. Yet it provided a framework within which those challenges could be met without constant disorientation. The steadiness of daily life acted as an anchor. Silence remained a companion rather than an absence. It allowed thoughts to align, emotions to settle. In silence, one could hear oneself more clearly. This internal clarity became a resource, carried forward into later years. As change accelerated in subsequent decades, many of us found ourselves returning inwardly to these early rhythms, not as a retreat, but as a reference point. We recognized when life felt unbalanced because we had known balance. We understood the cost of constant urgency because we had lived without it. The memory of that closer, more human world endures not because it was flawless, but because it aligned with fundamental human needs. It allowed time for attention, for relationship, for gradual growth. These qualities remain valuable regardless of era. As we continue to reflect, we do so with an awareness that what we carry forward from those years is not a desire to return, but an understanding of what sustains us. The lessons of that time remain available, embedded in our habits, our expectations, and our capacity for quiet presence. As we move further into reflection, it becomes apparent that one of the defining qualities of that earlier time was the way meaning accumulated slowly. Nothing demanded instant interpretation. Experiences were allowed to linger before being understood. We lived first, reflected later. This order mattered. It grounded understanding in reality rather than abstraction. Meaning emerged not from analysis, but from repetition and familiarity. We remember how the notion of progress was tied closely to continuity. Improvement did not require constant reinvention. It grew out of refinement. One became better at something by doing it again, with slightly more awareness each time. This applied not only to work, but to relationships, to habits, to one's way of being in the world. Growth was incremental, and because of that, it felt sustainable. The cadence of daily life encouraged attentiveness. There was time to notice when something was amiss, when a gesture carried hesitation, when a silence signaled more than rest. Sensitivity developed naturally because it was required. One could not rely on constant explanation. Understanding depended on observation. This sharpened perception and deepened connection. We recall how trust functioned within this environment. It was not declared or formalized. It was assumed until proven otherwise, and even then it was reconsidered slowly. Trust grew through consistent behavior rather than promises. This created a social atmosphere that was neither naive nor suspicious. It was balanced, grounded in experience. Time spent alone carried its own quiet value. Solitude was not framed as isolation. It was a natural part of the day. Moment alone allowed for rest, reflection, and simple presence. One did not feel compelled to fill every gap with activity or noise. Being alone was not something to avoid. It was something to accept. This acceptance extended to emotional states as well. Feelings were not constantly categorized or explained. One could feel uncertain, content, tired, or reflective without needing to label the experience. Emotional life unfolded organically. This reduced self-consciousness. One was not always watching oneself feel. One was simply feeling. We also recall how expectations were shaped by realism rather than idealization. Life was understood to include difficulty, delay, and limitation. These were not seen as failures of the system, but as part of existence. This understanding fostered resilience. When challenges arose, they were met with steadiness rather than surprise. The relationship between effort and outcome was clearer. One could see how actions led to results over time. This clarity reinforced responsibility. Choices mattered because their consequences were visible and enduring. There was less abstraction between cause and effect. This made learning more direct. Communication carried weight because it was not constant. When words were exchanged, they mattered. Letters, conversations, and announcements were anticipated and remembered. The infrequency of communication gave it substance. Each exchange occupied its own space and memory. Public discourse, though imperfect, unfolded within the same framework of measured exchange. Ideas circulated at a pace that allowed for digestion. Opinion did not require immediate response. Silence between exchanges was normal. This allowed positions to soften, to evolve. Dialogue was a process rather than a performance. The absence of relentless comparison shaped self-perception. One did not constantly measure one's life against distant standards. Reference points were local, familiar, attainable. This fostered self-acceptance. One knew one's strengths and limitations without constant evaluation. Confidence developed quietly, grounded in competence rather than display. We remember how learning continued throughout life without being formalized. Skills were acquired as needed through observation and practice. Curiosity was not directed toward constant novelty, but toward deeper understanding of familiar things. Mastery was valued. Depth mattered more than breadth. The physical environment supported this orientation. Spaces were designed for durability rather than rapid change. Buildings, furniture, and tools were meant to last. Their permanence contributed to a sense of stability. One lived among objects that carried history, reinforcing continuity. The passage of years was felt, but not feared. Aging was visible and accepted. It was not hidden or denied. Older individuals remained integrated into daily life. Their presence normalized. This fostered respect across generations. Wisdom was recognized through experience rather than authority alone. Celebrations, when they occurred, were grounded in tradition. Repetition did not diminish their meaning. It reinforced it. Familiar rituals provided reassurance. They linked past and present seamlessly. Through them, time felt layered rather than segmented. We also recall how disappointment was handled. It was acknowledged without dramatization. One learned to accept outcomes that differed from expectation. Recovery was supported by routine. Life continued, offering structure even when emotion wavered. This continuity provided comfort. The slower pace allowed values to settle deeply. Respect, patience, responsibility, attentiveness. These were not slogans. They were habits. Habits formed through repetition become character. Over time, these qualities shaped how we responded to the world, even as circumstances changed. As we look back, we see how this internalized steadiness became a reference point. When later life introduced speed, complexity, and fragmentation, we sensed the difference immediately. We felt in our bodies, in our attention, in our emotional responses. The contrast was unmistakable. Yet the memory of that earlier rhythm did not disappear. It remained available, a quiet template stored within us. We could return to it inwardly, even when external conditions differed. This internal continuity offered guidance without instruction. The world of the 1960s, as we experienced it, was not defined solely by its events, but by its tempo. It moved at a pace that allowed human faculties to remain aligned. Thought, emotion, and action were not constantly pulled apart. They worked together, supported by time rather than strained by it. As we continue this reflection, it becomes clear that what we remember most vividly is not what happened, but how it felt to live within that pace. It felt sufficient. It felt proportionate. It felt human. These qualities do not belong exclusively to one era. They belong to ways of living that honor attention, continuity, and presence. Having lived within such a framework, many of us carry its imprint forward. It shapes how we perceive the present and how we imagine what remains possible. In remembering that quieter world, we are not seeking to return to it unchanged. We are recognizing the elements that sustained us. We are acknowledging the inheritance of rhythm, patience, and quiet clarity that continues to inform our lives. Even now, as reflection deepens, we begin to notice how memory itself seems shaped by the calm architecture of those years. Recollection does not arrive in fragments or flashes, but as a steady unfolding. One thought leads naturally to another, as days once did. This continuity gives memory its reassuring quality. We do not struggle to assemble the past. It presents itself whole, carried by rhythm rather than urgency. The way we experience time allowed memory to form layers instead of piles. Moments were not stacked upon one another too quickly. Each had space to leave its trace before the next arrived. Because of this, the past does not feel crowded. It feels navigable. We can move through it slowly, pausing where we choose, without being overwhelmed. We recall how anticipation was woven gently into daily life. Looking forward to something did not dominate attention. It coexisted with the present. Waiting was not an empty space to be endured, but a period with its own texture. The interval between intention and fulfillment carried meaning. It allowed hope to mature without becoming impatience. This shaped our emotional balance. Joy did not need to be immediate to be satisfying. Fulfillment did not require constant reinforcement. Pleasure was often delayed, and this delay did not diminish it. It deepened it. By the time something arrived, we were ready to receive it fully. Disappointment, too, was tempered by time. When things did not unfold as expected, the surrounding structure of daily life absorbed the impact. Routine continued. Familiar actions provided stability. Emotion had room to settle naturally. There was no pressure to resolve everything at once. Acceptance developed gradually. The sense of personal history grew within this framework. Life felt like a coherent story rather than a series of unrelated episodes. Transitions were marked, but they were rarely abrupt. One phase gave way to another through overlap and adjustment. This continuity reduced disorientation. We knew where we came from because we could trace the path. The presence of elders in daily life reinforced this sense of narrative. Age was visible, integrated, and respected. Older individuals were not separated from the flow of life. Their pace influenced the collective rhythm. This moderated haste. It reminded everyone that time was shared across generations. We learned to value steadiness through observation. Watching someone maintain a habit, over years taught us more than any instruction could. Reliability became a form of quiet authority. One trusted those who showed up consistently, who acted predictably without rigidity. This trust formed the backbone of many relationships. Language carried this respect for continuity. Expressions were repeated across years, acquiring depth through use. Words did not need constant reinvention. Familiar phrases carried shared meaning. This created a sense of linguistic belonging. Speech connected individuals not only to one another, but to a shared past. The physical environment mirrored this stability. Places remained recognizable over time. Changes occurred, but they were gradual. One could return to a location after years and still feel oriented. This continuity supported memory. Places held stories, not because they were preserved deliberately, but because they endured. Movement through these spaces reinforced awareness. Walking familiar paths allowed thought to wander without losing direction. The body knew where it was going, freeing the mind to reflect. This integration of movement and thought fostered a sense of ease. Life did not feel like constant navigation. The absence of constant novelty reduced cognitive strain. One did not need to adapt continuously to new systems or expectations. This conserved attention. Energy could be directed toward engagement rather than adjustment. Life felt manageable because its demands were comprehensible. Work followed similar principles. Tasks were understood within a larger context. One knew how individual effort contributed to collective outcome. This clarity reinforced purpose. Even repetitive work carried meaning because its place in the whole was visible. We remember how recognition occurred quietly. Praise was not constant, but it was sincere. It mattered because it was rare. When acknowledgement came, it carried weight. This encouraged intrinsic motivation. One worked not for constant validation, but for the satisfaction of competence. The relationship between individual and community was balanced. Independence existed alongside interdependence. One was expected to manage one's responsibilities, but also to remain attentive to others. This balance reduced extremes. Neither isolation nor intrusion dominated. The pace of life allowed values to be transmitted without formalization. Children learned what mattered by watching what endured. They noticed which behaviors were repeated, which were corrected, which were quietly respected. Over time, these observations shaped character more effectively than instruction alone. The sense of order that emerged from this environment was flexible. It accommodated variation without losing coherence. This adaptability made it resilient. When change occurred, it was integrated rather than resisted. The underlying rhythm remained. As we reflect now, we recognize how these conditions supported a form of quiet confidence. One trusted oneself because one had time to learn. One trusted others because behavior was consistent. One trusted life because it unfolded predictably enough to feel reliable. This confidence did not manifest as certainty. It allowed room for doubt. But doubt existed within a framework of stability. One could question without feeling unmoored. This capacity for reflection without anxiety is one of the enduring gifts of that time. The memory of that world remains vivid not because it was ideal, but because it was proportionate. Demands matched capacity. Attention was respected. Time was allowed to do its work. These qualities created a sense of alignment that many of us continue to seek. As the years progressed and the world shifted toward greater speed and complexity, this internal reference became more noticeable. We sensed when alignment was lost because we had known it. We felt the cost of constant acceleration because we had lived without it. Yet this awareness did not turn into rejection. It became discernment. We learned to recognize which elements of the past remained relevant. We understood that while circumstances change, fundamental human needs do not. The closer, quieter world of those years taught us how to inhabit time with dignity. It showed us that meaning does not require constant stimulation. It grows through attention, continuity, and patience. These lessons remain accessible, not as nostalgia, but as guidance. As we continue to move forward, carrying the imprint of those rhythms, we do so with a deeper understanding of what sustains us. The past does not pull us backward. It steadies us. It reminds us that a human pace is not an obstacle to life, but its foundation. As we continue this long reflection, another quality of that earlier time becomes more apparent. The way attention was treated as something finite and valuable, even if it was never named as such. We did not speak of focus or distraction, yet life was organized in a way that naturally protected attention. Fewer demands competed for it at once. Because of this, we were able to give ourselves more fully to whatever we were doing, whether it was work, conversation, or rest. This protection of attention shaped how we experienced presence. Being somewhere meant actually being there. The mind did not constantly drift toward distant concerns or alternative possibilities. When we entered a space, we entered it with our whole selves. This gave ordinary moments a sense of completeness. Even simple actions felt grounded because they were not constantly interrupted by competing signals. We remember how listening carried weight. When someone spoke, others listened not as a courtesy alone, but because attention was available. There was no assumption that another task waited impatiently in the background. This allowed conversation to unfold naturally without haste. Meaning was not rushed. Understanding had time to form. This atmosphere reduced the need for constant explanation. Shared context filled many gaps. We knew the rhythms of one another's lives well enough to infer meaning. A delay, a pause, a change in tone was often understood without words. This quiet literacy of human behavior developed through long exposure to consistent patterns. The sense of being seen emerged from this attentiveness. One did not need to announce oneself repeatedly to be recognized. Familiarity did the work. Over time, this recognition created security. It reassured individuals that they belonged, that their presence mattered even when nothing extraordinary occurred. Daily life offered many moments of transition, yet these transitions were gentle. One activity yielded to another without abrupt separation. This smoothness reduced internal friction. The mind adjusted gradually, moving from effort to rest, from engagement to reflection. Such transition supported emotional balance, preventing extremes of tension or disengagement. The world also allowed for forgetting in a healthy way. Not every moment demanded retention. Some experiences passed quietly, leaving no lasting trace. This was not loss, but relief. Memory was selective, preserving what mattered most. This selectivity prevented overload. It allowed the past to remain coherent rather than cluttered. The absence of constant recording played a role in this. Experiences existed primarily in the moment and in memory. This encouraged full engagement. One did not stand apart from life in order to capture it. One lived it directly. The result was a deeper sense of participation. We recall how effort was distributed across time rather than concentrated into bursts. Tasks were approached steadily, without urgency. This sustained effort was less exhausting than constant acceleration. Energy was conserved. One could continue day after day without depletion because the pace was humane. This steady approach influenced health, both physical and mental. The body was allowed to follow natural rhythms of exertion and rest. The mind was not constantly stimulated beyond its capacity. Stress existed, but it was not chronic. Recovery was built into daily life. The relationship between individual ambition and collective stability was balanced. Personal goals were pursued within a shared framework. One did not feel compelled to outrun others in order to succeed. Progress was not framed as competition alone. This reduced anxiety and resentment. It allowed cooperation to coexist with aspiration. We also remember how authority figures often embodied the values they represented. Guidance was grounded in example. This consistency between word and action reinforced trust. One could rely on what was observed rather than what was promised. This alignment reduced confusion and cynicism. Education, in this broader sense, was experiential. One learned by doing, by watching, by repeating. Knowledge accumulated slowly, becoming integrated rather than superficial. Understanding felt earned. This fostered confidence without arrogance. The sense of place was strong. Locations were not interchangeable. Each carried its own atmosphere, shaped by use and memory. Returning to a familiar place evoked recognition, not only of space, but of self. One remembered who one had been there before. This continuity reinforced identity. Silence, again, played a crucial role. It was present between sounds, between words, between events. It allowed experiences to resonate. Without silence, meaning dissipates quickly. With silence, it deepens. In those years, silence was abundant and accepted. As we reflect now, we recognize how rare such silence has become. Yet, we also recognize that it remains essential. Having known it, we understand its value. We know how it supports clarity, patience, and emotional balance. The quieter world of the 1960s did not isolate individuals from one another. On the contrary, it brought them closer. With fewer distractions, attention naturally turned outward. Relationships were sustained through presence rather than constant contact. This created depth rather than breadth. Time spent together did not need to be justified by productivity. It was enough to be together. This acceptance removed pressure. It allowed relationships to unfold naturally, without constant evaluation. Trust grew through shared time rather than shared achievements. The rhythm of daily life also allowed for boredom, a state that is often misunderstood. Boredom created space for imagination. Without constant stimulation, the mind generated its own activity. Creativity emerged from emptiness rather than excess. This capacity for inner engagement became a resource. We remember how children learned to occupy time without external direction. This fostered independence and adaptability. One learned to create meaning rather than consume it. This skill carried forward into adulthood, supporting resilience and self-reliance. As the world gradually changed, introducing greater speed and density of information, these earlier capacities became more noticeable. We felt when attention was strained because we had known ease. We sensed when silence was absent because we had lived with it. This awareness did not necessarily lead to rejection of change. It led to discernment. We learned to choose where to give attention, where to slow down, where to preserve continuity. The memory of a quieter pace informed these choices. The closer, more human world of those years left us with an internal compass. It points toward balance, proportion, and presence. It reminds us that life does not need to be constantly amplified to be meaningful. Depth often emerges from steadiness. As we continue to carry these reflections, we see that what endures is not the specific conditions of the past, but the understanding they fostered. Having lived within a rhythm that honored attention and time, we retain the ability to recognize when life feels aligned. This recognition is not nostalgic longing. It is quiet knowledge. It guides us gently, encouraging us to preserve what remains essential even as circumstances evolve. In this way, the legacy of that quieter world continues to live within us, shaping how we inhabit the present and imagine the future. As the reflection carries on, we begin to recognize how the passage of time itself felt different, not only in pace but in texture. Time was something we moved within, not something that pressed against us. We did not feel pursued by it. Days arrived, unfolded, and concluded with a sense of completeness. This allowed us to inhabit each moment without the persistent awareness of what followed. The present was sufficient. This sufficiency shaped our relationship with expectation. We anticipated future events, yet we did not live in anticipation alone. Looking forward did not overshadow looking around. The present retained its integrity. Because of this balance, the future did not feel like an escape from the now, but a continuation of it. Life moved forward without abandoning itself. We recall how responsibility was assumed gradually. One was not expected to know everything at once. Understanding developed through exposure and repetition. This gradual assumption of responsibility created confidence rooted in experience rather than theory. One learned by doing, by adjusting, by observing the effects of one's actions over time. Mistakes were part of this learning. They were acknowledged without being magnified. Correction followed naturally, often through example rather than reprimand. This fostered resilience. One did not fear error excessively, because error did not threaten belonging. It was understood as part of growth. The sense of belonging itself was grounded in continuity. One belonged because one was present, because one participated regularly. There was no need for constant affirmation. Belonging was assumed until broken, and even then it was reconsidered patiently. This stability supported emotional security. We remember how the rhythms of daily life reinforced this sense of security. Familiar sounds, repeated gestures, predictable sequences, all contributed to a feeling of orientation. One knew where one was in the day, in the week, in the season. This orientation reduced anxiety. Life felt navigable because its structure was legible. The natural world played a central role in this legibility. Light, weather, and temperature provided cues that guided behavior. We adjusted without instruction. These adjustments linked us to cycles larger than ourselves. This awareness fostered humility and patience. It reminded us that life moved according to rhythms not entirely of our making. In this context, waiting was not experienced as wasted time. It was simply time. The space between intention and outcome had its own character. It allowed for reconsideration, for acceptance, for quiet hope. Outcomes arrived with less shock, whether favorable or not, because time had prepared us. We also recall how possessions were integrated into life without dominating it. Objects were valued for their function and durability. They were maintained rather than constantly replaced. This created continuity. Familiar objects accompanied us through years, accumulating meaning through use rather than novelty. The care taken with these objects reflected a broader respect for continuity. Preserving what worked was seen as sensible, not conservative. Improvement occurred through refinement, not replacement alone. This approach fostered patience and appreciation. Relationships, too, were shaped by this respect for time. Trust developed slowly, through repeated interaction. Bonds were strengthened through shared routine rather than dramatic declaration. This gradual deepening created durability. Relationships endured because they were woven into daily life. Conversation reflected this durability. Topics returned, evolved, deepened. Repetition was not avoided. It was how understanding grew. Each return added nuance, shaped by new experience. Listening became an act of participation in a shared history. Public life allowed for the same gradualness. Change occurred, but it was absorbed into existing structures. New ideas were tested, discussed, refined. There was time for adjustment. This reduced polarization. Differences existed, but they unfolded within a shared framework. The absence of constant urgency influenced how we perceived success. Achievement was recognized, but it was not constantly displayed. Success was measured over time, through reliability and contribution. This fostered humility. One remained aware that effort mattered more than recognition. We remember how recognition, when offered, carried weight. It was meaningful because it was not constant. Praise was specific and grounded. It acknowledged effort rather than spectacle. This encouraged intrinsic motivation. The emotional climate of daily life benefited from this moderation. Feelings were experienced without constant amplification. One did not feel compelled to perform emotion. Joy, sadness, satisfaction, and disappointment all had space to exist without being exaggerated. This balance supported emotional health. The pace of life allowed reflection to occur naturally. One did not need to schedule time for contemplation. It emerged in the spaces between activities, in quiet moments that were not filled. Thought unfolded at its own pace. Understanding developed gradually. Memory, formed within this environment, retained coherence. Experiences connected to one another, forming a narrative rather than a collection. This narrative provided identity. One knew oneself through continuity, through patterns that endured. As we consider these qualities now, we recognize how they shaped our capacity to endure later change. Having known steadiness, we could recognize instability. Having lived within proportion, we could sense imbalance. This awareness did not prevent change, but informed our response to it. We also recognized that the quieter pace did not eliminate ambition or creativity. On the contrary, it supported them. Ideas had time to develop. Projects unfolded without constant interruption. Creativity thrived within constraints that protected attention. The absence of constant distraction allowed imagination to flourish. The mind had space to wander, to connect ideas, to explore possibilities. This internal activity was not driven by external prompts. It emerged from within. This fostered originality, grounded in reflection. The presence of routine did not stifle variation. It provided a framework within which variation could occur meaningfully. Small changes were noticeable because the background was stable. This made life feel rich without being overwhelming. As the years passed and external conditions evolved, these internalized patterns remained. We carried with us an understanding of rhythm, of balance, of the value of unhurried presence. This understanding became a quiet resource. When faced with acceleration, we knew the cost. When confronted with fragmentation, we sensed the loss. Yet we also knew that the qualities we valued could be preserved internally, even if external circumstances differed. The memory of that closer, more human world continues to inform our choices. It reminds us that attention is finite, that time is not merely something to manage, and that presence is essential to meaning. These reminders are not demands. They are invitations. As we move through the present, carrying these reflections, we do so with a deeper appreciation for what sustains us. The past does not dictate the future, but it illuminates possibilities. It shows us that a life aligned with human rhythm is not an idealization, but a lived reality. In remembering the 1960s, we remember not only an era, but a way of inhabiting time. We remember how life felt when it moved at a pace that allowed understanding to grow, relationships to deepen, and meaning to settle. This remembrance remains with us, shaping our awareness and guiding our sense of what remains essential. As reflection continues, we begin to sense more clearly how deeply the idea of continuity shaped our sense of safety. Not safety in the physical sense alone, but a quieter, more pervasive feeling that life itself was reliable. The world did not promise ease, yet it offered coherence. One could wake each day with the expectation that certain structures would hold. This expectation reduced fear. It allowed attention to rest rather than remain constantly alert. We remember how change, when it came, rarely arrived without warning. Shifts unfolded gradually. There was time to notice them, to discuss them, to adapt. This gradualness softened their impact. Even significant transitions were absorbed into daily life rather than imposed upon it. The unfamiliar became familiar through exposure rather than force. This process shaped how we understood uncertainty. The unknown existed, but it did not dominate consciousness. Because most things followed recognizable patterns, uncertainty occupied a limited space. It was not constantly amplified. This allowed curiosity to coexist with caution. One could approach the new without feeling overwhelmed. The rhythm of days supported this balance. Mornings carried a sense of renewal without urgency. Afternoons allowed for steady continuation. Evenings offered closure without finality. Sleep arrived as a natural conclusion rather than an escape. Waking did not feel like re-entry into chaos, but a return to something already in motion. The continuity between days extended across years. One could look back and see how life had unfolded in stages that made sense. Even when outcomes differed from expectation, the path connecting them remained visible. This visibility fostered acceptance. One could understand how one had arrived where one was, even if the destination had not been planned. We recall how advice was offered sparingly. Guidance carried weight because it was not constant. When someone spoke with authority, it was usually grounded in experience. This created respect without intimidation. One listened because one recognized the depth behind the words. Learning followed the same pattern. Knowledge was transmitted through example and repetition. One absorbed skills gradually, often without realizing when understanding had taken root. Mastery did not arrive suddenly. It emerged quietly, revealed through competence rather than declaration. The relationship between effort and reward felt proportional. Work was expected, and reward followed in measured ways. There was no assumption of immediate gratification. This fostered patience. One learned to invest time and energy with the understanding that results would unfold gradually. This proportionality shaped ambition. Goals existed, but they were tempered by realism. One did not expect everything at once. Progress was measured across years rather than moments. This long view reduced anxiety. It allowed aspiration to coexist with contentment. We remember how personal responsibility was framed not as burden, but as contribution. Fulfilling one's role supported the larger whole. This connection gave purpose to effort. One did not feel isolated in one's duties. They were part of a shared structure. The social environment reinforced this understanding. People noticed reliability. They remembered consistency. Reputation grew from repeated action rather than single events. This encouraged steadiness. One acted responsibly not for recognition, but because it felt appropriate. Communication mirrored this steadiness. Messages were clear and concise. There was little need for constant clarification. Shared context did much of the work. This reduced misunderstanding. When conflict arose, it unfolded within an existing framework of relationship. The pace of exchange allowed for repair. Disagreements were not necessarily final. There was time for reconsideration, for apology, for adjustment. Relationships endured because they were not constantly tested by urgency. Public life benefited from the same quality. Debate existed, but it was tempered by patience. Ideas circulated slowly enough to be examined. Change was negotiated rather than imposed. This process was imperfect, but it allowed for participation without constant polarization. The absence of constant pressure influenced how we experienced aging. Growing older was visible and accepted. Each stage of life carried its own expectations and privileges. There was less urgency to remain fixed in one identity. Transition was natural. This acceptance fostered intergenerational continuity. Younger and older individuals shared spaces and routines. Learning flowed both ways. Experience was valued, and curiosity was encouraged. This mutual presence reduced separation between stages of life. The sense of time as something shared rather than owned shaped social behavior. One was mindful of others' pace. Waiting was not always seen as inconvenience. It was part of coexistence. This fostered courtesy without formal rules. We also recall how quiet moments carried significance. Sitting without speaking, walking without destination, observing without comment. These activities were not empty. They were restorative. They allowed the mind to reset without conscious effort. Such moments contributed to emotional regulation. Feelings were processed gradually. There was space for thought between stimulus and response. This reduced impulsivity. One learned to pause naturally, without instruction. The physical environment supported this rhythm. Spaces were designed for durability and comfort rather than constant novelty. Familiar surroundings reduced cognitive load. One did not need to reinterpret one's environment constantly. This stability supported calm. As we reflect now, we recognize how these conditions supported mental clarity. Attention was not fragmented. Thought could unfold sequentially. Understanding deepened through sustained focus rather than rapid exposure. This clarity influenced creativity. Ideas developed slowly, tested against experience, refined through repetition. Originality emerged from depth rather than speed. Creativity was integrated into daily life rather than separated from it. The quieter pace also allowed for humility. One recognized limits without feeling diminished. Not knowing everything was acceptable. Learning was ongoing. This openness fostered curiosity without pressure. As decades passed and the world accelerated, these internalized qualities remained. We carried with us an understanding of proportion. We sensed when demands exceeded capacity. We recognized when attention was strained. This awareness did not necessarily lead to resistance. It led to choice. We learned to protect certain rhythms, to create space where possible, to slow down intentionally when needed. The memory of a more measured world informed these decisions. The legacy of that time is not nostalgia for its forms, but appreciation for its pace. It reminds us that life does not need to be compressed to be meaningful. Depth requires time. Understanding requires continuity. As we continue this reflection, we see more clearly how that earlier world shaped our inner architecture. It gave us a foundation of steadiness, patience, and quiet confidence. These qualities remain available, guiding us gently even now, as we move through a world that often feels faster and less predictable. As the reflection reaches deeper layers, we become increasingly aware that what truly distinguished those years was not any single habit or routine, but the way life allowed for internal coherence. Thoughts, emotions, and actions were not constantly pulled in different directions. They aligned more naturally because the surrounding world moved at a compatible pace. This alignment created a quiet sense of integrity, a feeling that one's inner life and outer circumstances were not in constant negotiation. We remember how decision-making felt grounded. Choices were made within familiar frameworks. One rarely faced an overwhelming array of options. This limitation was not experienced as restriction, but as clarity. Knowing the boundaries within which decisions would be made reduced anxiety. It allowed one to focus on discernment rather than selection. Life felt manageable because its possibilities were intelligible. This clarity extended to moral understanding. Values were not endlessly debated or redefined. They were lived. Right and wrong were understood through consistent behavior rather than abstract discussion. This did not eliminate disagreement, but it provided a shared baseline. One could differ without feeling unmoored. There was a common ground that supported dialogue. We recall how responsibility was distributed across time. One was not expected to resolve everything immediately. Problems could remain unresolved for a while without causing panic. This tolerance for incompletion reduced pressure. It allowed solutions to emerge gradually, shaped by experience rather than urgency. The ability to wait was central to this tolerance. Waiting was not seen as passive. It was an active state, requiring patience and trust. Trust that time would clarify what action alone could not. This trust was reinforced by experience. Again and again, we saw that many things resolved themselves given enough time. We remember how routines created space for reflection without isolating it as a separate activity. One did not need to step away from life to think about it. Thought occurred within action, alongside it. Walking, working, resting, all allowed room for reflection. This integration prevented overanalysis. Understanding grew organically. The sense of proportion that emerged from this environment influenced emotional life profoundly. Feelings were experienced fully, but they were contextualized. One did not mistake a difficult moment for a permanent condition. Perspective was supported by continuity. Tomorrow would come, carrying familiar elements that grounded emotion. We also recall how expectations were calibrated realistically. Life was understood to include effort, disappointment, and delay. These were not signs of failure, but aspects of existence. This understanding fostered endurance. One did not give up easily because difficulty was not unexpected. The social environment reinforced this endurance. Support was present, but it was not always verbalized. One felt held by routine, by presence, by familiarity. Help arrived quietly, often without being named. This understated support strengthened resilience without creating dependence. Communication reflected this understated quality. Important matters were discussed directly, without excessive framing. There was trust and shared understanding. This reduced misinterpretation. When clarification was needed, it was offered calmly. Conversation did not escalate quickly. Tone remained measured. The pace of information exchange allowed comprehension to keep up. News, ideas, and opinions circulated slowly enough to be absorbed. One could form an opinion without feeling rushed. This supported thoughtful engagement rather than reactive response. The absence of constant interruption allowed concentration to deepen. When one worked, one worked. When one rested, one rested. Boundaries between activities were respected. This clarity reduced cognitive fatigue. Energy was preserved. We remember how evenings often carried a reflective quality. The day's events settled gradually. One could review without judgment. This gentle review fostered learning. Experience was integrated rather than dismissed. Tomorrow's adjustments grew naturally from today's reflection. The continuity between days supported this learning. One could try something again, slightly differently. Improvement was iterative. Failure was informative rather than discouraging. Progress unfolded through accumulation rather than breakthrough. The presence of tradition reinforced this accumulation. Familiar practices returned regularly, providing structure. These practices did not feel imposed. They felt anchoring. They connected present action to past experience seamlessly. We also recall how the pace of life allowed for forgiveness. Mistakes were remembered, but they were not endlessly revisited. Time softened their impact. Relationships recovered because there was space for repair. This fostered trust and durability. The physical environment contributed to this sense of repair. Familiar places offered reassurance. Returning to known surroundings after difficulty restored equilibrium. Space itself carried memory, supporting continuity. As years passed, we internalized these supports. Even when environments changed, we carried with us an understanding of how to create steadiness. We knew the value of routine, of pause, of measured response. These became internal habits. When later life introduced greater complexity and speed, these habits provided balance. We recognized when life felt misaligned. We understood the importance of restoring proportion. We learned to step back, to slow down, to reconnect with rhythm. This ability to self-regulate was not taught explicitly. It emerged from having lived within a system that modeled it consistently. Having experienced alignment, we could recognize disalignment. Having known patience, we could identify haste. The quieter world of those years also shaped our sense of meaning. Meaning did not need constant reinforcement. It emerged from participation in life as it was lived. Contribution, presence, and continuity provided purpose without requiring constant articulation. As we reflect now, we see how the sense of meaning endured. It did not depend on circumstances, remaining unchanged. It adapted. Even as external structures shifted, the internal understanding remained accessible. The memory of that time serves as a reference rather than a destination. It reminds us of what is possible when life moves at a pace compatible with human attention and emotion. It shows us that coherence is not accidental. It is cultivated through rhythm and restraint. This reflection does not deny the value of change or innovation. It simply acknowledges the cost of speed when it exceeds capacity. It invites consideration of balance. It suggests that progress need not abandon proportion. As we carry these insights forward, we do so quietly. They inform our choices without demanding allegiance. They guide us gently, reminding us of the value of patience, continuity, and presence. The legacy of that closer, more human world lives not in specific practices, but in the internal architecture it shaped. It taught us how to inhabit time without being consumed by it. It showed us that life gains depth when it is allowed to unfold at a human pace. As this reflection continues, we hold this understanding with gratitude. It remains a steady presence, supporting us as we navigate the present and imagine what lies ahead, grounded in the knowledge that coherence, once lived, is never entirely lost. As this long reflection reaches its final movement, we find ourselves returning, almost naturally, to the quiet center from which all these memories seem to radiate. What remains most vivid is not a sequence of events, nor a catalog of habits, but a way of inhabiting life that felt proportioned to human capacity. The world, as many of us experienced it, did not demand constant explanation. It allowed us to live first and to understand later. We remember how the sense of continuity extended beyond daily routines into a deeper confidence in life itself. There was an assumption, rarely spoken, that things will hold together, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but sufficiently. This assumption did not make us complacent. It made us calm. It allowed effort to be applied steadily rather than urgently. We moved forward without the persistent fear of collapse. The passage of years was felt as accumulation rather than erosion. Time added layers to experience. It did not merely take things away. Even loss, when it occurred, was absorbed into a larger narrative that continued to make sense. Life felt durable because it was built from repeated acts of attention, responsibility, and care. We recall how meaning did not arrive in moments of intensity alone. It emerged quietly from participation, doing what needed to be done, showing up where one was expected, paying attention to what was present. These acts carried weight. They created a sense of purpose that did not require constant affirmation. One knew why one mattered because one's presence had a place. The relationship between individual life and the larger flow of time felt balanced. One did not feel swallowed by history, nor detached from it. The past informed the present, and the present prepared the future, without either dominating awareness. This balance fostered humility. One recognized oneself as part of something ongoing, neither central nor insignificant. We also remember how this balance influenced hope. Hope was not dramatic. It was quiet and persistent. It did not require certainty. It rested on continuity. Having seen life unfold gradually before, One trusted that it would continue to do so. Even in uncertainty, there was confidence that time itself was an ally rather than an adversary. The pace of life allowed relationships to mature fully. Bonds deepened through shared experience rather than constant exchange. Trust grew because behavior remained consistent over time. This consistency created emotional safety. One did not need to constantly test relationships. They endured because they were woven into daily life. The sense of belonging that emerged from this environment was understated but strong. One belonged because one was present, because one participated, because one was known. Belonging did not depend on performance. It rested on continuity. This allowed individuals to be themselves without constant self-monitoring. As the world gradually changed, introducing greater speed and complexity, this earlier experience became more visible by contrast. We felt the difference not as a critique, but as a recognition. We recognized when attention was stretched too thin. We noticed when time felt compressed. These sensations did not come from theory. They came from having lived otherwise. Yet this recognition did not require rejection of the present. It invited discernment. Having known a world that moved more slowly, we understood the value of choosing where to slow down. We learned that not every demand requires immediate response. We learned to protect certain rhythms, even quietly, within our own lives. The memory of that closer, more human world thus became a resource rather than a refuge. It did not pull us backward. It steadied us. It offered perspective when life felt fragmented. It reminded us that coherence is possible, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived experience. We also came to understand that the qualities we valued, patience, attentiveness, continuity, were not bound to a single era. They were expressions of fundamental human needs. The world of the 1960s made them visible because conditions allowed them to flourish, but they remain accessible wherever space is made for them. This understanding brings a quiet sense of responsibility. Having known a pace that honored human attention, we recognize the importance of passing on not just memories, but sensibilities. We do so not through instruction, but through example, just as we once learned. By slowing when possible, by listening fully, by allowing time to do its work, we embody what we value. The legacy of that time is therefore subtle. It lives in habits of mind and heart. It appears in how we wait, how we listen, how we accept what cannot be rushed. It shows itself in our tolerance for silence, in our respect for gradual growth, in our trust in continuity. As we look back now, with the long view that age affords, we see more clearly what that world offered. It offered room to notice, room to learn, room to become. It did not promise perfection. It offered proportion. And in that proportion, many of us found a sense of dignity that has endured. The feeling of home that we associate with that era was not limited to a physical place. It was a way of being oriented in the world. Home was the assurance that life made sense at a human scale, that one's efforts were connected to outcomes, that time could be trusted to unfold meaningfully. This sense of home can still be felt even now, when we allow ourselves to slow, to attend, to remain present without urgency. It returns in moments of quiet recognition, when the noise recedes and we remember how it feels to be fully where we are. As this reflection comes to rest, it does so without conclusion in the usual sense. There is no final lesson to extract, no directive to follow. There is only an acknowledgement of what was lived and what remains. The quieter, closer world of those years shaped us not by instruction, but by example. It taught us that life does not need to be accelerated to be meaningful. That depth emerges from continuity. That attention is a form of care. That time, when allowed to move at a human pace, becomes a companion rather than a constraint. These understandings remain with us. They do not demand allegiance. They offer guidance. They invite us, gently, to remember what it feels like when the world aligns with our capacity to live within it. And in that remembering, we find not a longing for what is past, but a quiet confidence in what endures.